There's a kind of self-betrayal that rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It does not usually appear as open collapse, obvious sacrifice, or a visible life crisis. In fact, it often looks respectable, mature, kind, reasonable. You stay calm. You avoid conflict. You make things easier for everyone. You soften what you really feel, so the atmosphere remains manageable. You say yes when saying no would create friction. You stay understanding long after understanding has turned into self-erasure. You keep the peace. And because keeping the peace is often praised, it can take a very long time before you realize what it has started costing you. At first, the pattern feels harmless, even necessary. A disagreement appears, and instead of bringing your full truth into it, you instinctively reduce yourself. Not because you're lying exactly, but because you already know what version of your truth will be easiest for the room to tolerate. So you offer that version, a smaller version, a cleaner version, a less disruptive version. You tell yourself it is not worth attention. You tell yourself the issue is minor. You tell yourself that being flexible is wiser, more loving, more emotionally intelligent. And sometimes it is. That is what makes this pattern so difficult to name. It is built out of qualities that are not bad in themselves. Patience, sensitivity, empathy, awareness of how others feel, the ability to regulate yourself, the wish not to make things worse. All of these can be beautiful human capacities, but at a certain point, something subtle changes. You are no longer choosing peace from freedom. You are preserving peace by abandoning yourself. That difference is the whole story. It often reveals itself in tiny moments first. Someone asks you to do something you do not want to do, and your body says no before your mouth says yes. Someone crosses a line, and instead of naming it, you explain their behavior to yourself until your own reaction seems unreasonable. Someone speaks to you in a way that hurts, and rather than letting the hurt become clear, you move straight into understanding why they're stressed, why they did not mean it that way, why you should probably just let it go. This is how self-betrayal often begins, not with dishonesty in the obvious sense, with internal override. Your own signals become secondary to maintaining emotional equilibrium outside yourself. And because this happens so quickly, you may not even register as a choice. It feels automatic, natural, almost like a moral instinct. Keep things smooth. Do not escalate. Do not be difficult. Do not burden people with too much feeling. Do not risk becoming the source of discomfort. Those rules may never have been spoken explicitly. Still, they can shape an entire life. You may begin noticing how often your body speaks first. Tightness in the chest, a sinking feeling, exhaustion after agreeing to something, irritation you cannot quite justify, a low-level resentment that lingers after certain conversations. These are often the first clues, because the mind may still tell a clean story. I was just being kind. I was just being understanding. I was just keeping things simple. But the body often tells another truth. Something was not simple. Something was not kind to you. Something in you got left behind in the name of keeping the atmosphere comfortable. This becomes especially painful in relationships where you are known as the understanding one, the easy one, the emotionally mature one, the one who does not overreact, the one who can take a step back, see the bigger picture, and avoid unnecessary conflict. These roles can become deeply stabilizing, not only for others, but for your identity. You may start taking pride in how little you need, how little you ask for, how rarely you make things difficult. And over time, you may even stop noticing how much of yourself has been trimmed away to sustain that image. That is one of the most painful parts of this pattern. It is often rewarded. People appreciate how calm you are, how gracious you are, how easy you make things, how much you understand, how rarely you force anyone to confront what is uncomfortable. And because the world often responds warmly to this version of you, it becomes harder to question whether the pattern is healthy. But appreciation is not the same as intimacy, and harmony is not the same as truth. This is where the deeper loneliness of people-pleasing and peacekeeping begins. You may be surrounded by people who think highly of you, who feel close to you, who trust your steadiness, your kindness, your reliability. And yet some part of you remains unseen, not because others are intentionally ignoring you, because the version of you they are meeting is the one most carefully edited for their comfort. That version may be loving. It may even be real in part, but it is often incomplete. Your anger gets softened before it reaches language. Your preferences get negotiated away before they are fully expressed. Your limits appear late, if they appear at all. Your yes arrives on time, while your no is delayed, qualified, apologized for, or swallowed completely. Over time, this creates a particular kind of internal split. Externally, you remain functional. Internally, your own experience becomes harder to trust. You may start second-guessing your reactions because so much of your energy goes into understanding other people before understanding yourself. You may feel resentment and then judge yourself for it. You may feel exhaustion and call it sensitivity. You may feel anger and immediately turn into guilt. You may want distance and then convince yourself that wanting distance is selfish. This is how the self gets buried quietly, not under obvious oppression, under interpretation, rationalization, moral pressure, the belief that goodness means making yourself easier to live with. If you stay in this pattern long enough, a strange thing begins to happen. You lose contact with what you actually want, not all at once, gradually, because wanting becomes dangerous whenever it creates inconvenience. You stop asking direct questions inside yourself. Do I want to be here? Do I agree with this? Do I have the energy for this? Does this feel right? And even when those questions do appear, the answers often get reorganized around everyone else's comfort before they can reach action. This can make life feel increasingly dull, confusing, or draining, not because you lack gratitude, because too much of your energy is going into the maintenance of peace rather than the expression of truth. That maintenance is exhausting. It requires continuous inner calculation. How do I say this without upsetting them? Can I make this easier to hear? Should I mention it at all? Is it worth it? Maybe I should just let it go. Sometimes letting it go is wisdom, but sometimes letting it go is another name for leaving yourself behind. And if you do that often enough, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. You may notice it in your relationships first. A quiet resentment toward people you also love, a feeling that others take from you without even realizing it. A strange invisibility that is hard to explain because technically you are included, listened to, perhaps even appreciated, and yet not deeply met. That is because the self others are meeting has become too adapted, too modified around safety, too shaped by the emotional weather of the people around you. You may also notice it in your body. Fatigue after social contact, a heaviness after saying yes, irritation that appears late and seems disproportionate until you realize it has been accumulating. Even numbness can enter here, not because you no longer care, because caring has become fused with self-suppression to the point that your system starts protecting itself through disconnection. This is one of the hidden tragedies of chronic peacekeeping. The very qualities that once helped you remain connected to others begin cutting you off from yourself. At some point, that inner disconnection becomes too painful to continue ignoring. You start noticing how often your mouth and body disagree, how often your social self and inner self are not aligned, how often you leave interactions feeling depleted, not because anything dramatic happened, but because one more small betrayal of self took place in the name of emotional smoothness. And that is where the deeper question finally emerges. Not simply, why do I keep saying yes? Or, why is it so hard for me to create conflict? But something much more serious. What has peace come to mean in my psyche that I am willing to disappear a little in order to preserve it? That is the real threshold. Because once you ask that honestly, you are no longer only talking about people-pleasing. You are beginning to see a deeper structure, one in which your own truth has become negotiable whenever harmony is at stake. And until that structure becomes conscious, you may keep mistaking self-abandonment for kindness. You may keep calling self-erasure maturity. You may keep believing that the discomfort you save others from is worth more than the self you keep leaving behind. That is where this journey begins. Not with boundaries in the superficial sense, with the painful realization that keeping the peace may have become one of the most socially acceptable ways you betray yourself. What makes this pattern so difficult to break is that it often feels morally correct. That is what gives it so much power. If you were openly dishonest with yourself, If you were obviously betraying your own needs in a way that looked destructive or chaotic, you might recognize the problem sooner. But when self-abandonment comes dressed as patience, compassion, maturity, and emotional regulation, the psyche can remain loyal to it for years without questioning what is really happening. Carl Jung would not stop at the behavior itself. He would ask what psychic arrangement has formed such that the individual repeatedly chooses outer harmony over inner truth, even when the cost becomes chronic exhaustion, resentment, and loss of self-contact. The answer often begins with the persona. The persona, as Jung described it, is the social face of the psyche. It is the adaptation that allows you to move through the world in a way others can understand. It is not false in itself. It is necessary. No one lives without some version of it. But when the persona becomes overdeveloped, especially around one good quality, it begins carrying far more of the psyche than it should. This is often what happens with the persona of goodness. You become the calm one, the easy one, the understanding one, the one who can absorb complexity without making too much noise about it, the one who does not create trouble, the one whose value is tied to being emotionally manageable for others. At first, this may be rewarded heavily. Maybe you were praised for being mature, especially when others around you were not. Maybe you learned that love came more easily when you stayed reasonable. Maybe peace in the environment depended on your ability to soften yourself. Maybe conflict felt dangerous enough that adaptation seemed wiser than truth. Whatever the original conditions, the adaptation eventually hardens into identity. You stop using the role. You become it. And once that happens, saying no longer feels like a simple relational act. It feels like a threat to the structure of who you are. This is why peacekeeping can become so compulsive. You are not only avoiding discomfort, you are preserving a self-image. Jung would likely point out that the ego becomes deeply invested in personae that produce belonging. If the good version of you gets accepted, appreciated, trusted, or loved, then the ego begins treating that version as essential for survival. It becomes difficult to imagine that truth, anger, refusal, disagreement, or self-assertion could coexist with love or belonging. That is where the split begins. The socially acceptable self stays conscious. The disruptive self goes into shadow. This is crucial, because the shadow does not only contain what is dark in a crude sense, it contains whatever the conscious personality cannot admit into identity. If your conscious self is built around kindness, patience, and emotional smoothness, then irritation, aggression, preference, selfishness, frustration, and even simple resistance can become shadow material. And once something becomes shadowed, it does not disappear. It becomes charged. It moves underground. It influences behavior indirectly. This is why many chronic peacekeepers experience resentment that feels confusing even to them. Consciously, they're being good. Unconsciously, the shadow is filling with all the no's, angers, and refusals that never reach expression. The psyche does not like one-sidedness. Jung saw this again and again. Whenever the conscious self identifies too strongly with one pole, the repressed opposite gathers force in the unconscious. So the person who lives as endlessly agreeable may begin feeling silent rage. The person who always understands others may lose the ability to understand themselves. The person who avoids conflict at all costs may become inwardly hostile, depleted, or emotionally numb. This is not hypocrisy. It is compensation. The unconscious is trying to restore psychic balance where the conscious attitude has become too narrow. That is why peacekeeping eventually becomes so exhausting. It is not merely the effort of being nice. It is the effort of holding together a one-sided identity while the opposite qualities keep pressing from below. Jung would also want us to look at complexes here, especially guilt and abandonment complexes. For many people, conflict is not experienced as a neutral relational event. It is emotionally linked to older fears, loss of love, punishment, emotional withdrawal, volatility, rejection, or shame. If your psyche learned that upsetting others at a high emotional cost, then peacekeeping becomes more than politeness. It becomes survival strategy. In that case, when you are about to express a need, a limit, a disagreement, or a refusal, the reaction in the body is immediate. The nervous system senses danger before the mind has time to reflect. You do not simply think, I would rather avoid this. You feel something far stronger. Do not do this. This will cost you. That is why so many people betray themselves automatically, not because they consciously value others more than themselves, because the body has learned to associate self-expression with loss. The outer situation may no longer be dangerous. The present people may not be punishing, but the psyche is still organized around an old emotional law. Jung's approach helps clarify that this law is not just behavioral conditioning. It becomes woven into identity. You may start seeing yourself as a kind of person who is just naturally easygoing, not confrontational, or able to let things go. Sometimes that description is partly true, but often it also conceals fear. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but fear of what the relationship will become if the more difficult parts of you are allowed to appear. This is where the persona of goodness becomes a prison. The more you are identified with being the reasonable one, the less room there is for your full humanity. You can be thoughtful, but not angry, kind, but not unwilling, caring, but not unwilling to be inconveniencing, empathic, but not too desirous, available, but not too full of your own needs. Eventually, this becomes unsustainable, because the psyche cannot remain split forever without consequence. One of those consequences is resentment. Another is numbness. Another is confusion about what you really feel. This confusion matters more than people realize. If you repeatedly override your own signals, you eventually stop hearing them clearly. The psyche learns that your inner truth is negotiable. Your body says no, but your social self says yes. Your energy says stop, but your role says continue. Your anger says this matters, but your adapted self says be understanding. Over time, the channels between felt truth and expressed life begin to weaken. This is why chronic peacekeeping often leads not only to exhaustion, but to identity loss. You stop knowing what is truly yours because so much of your consciousness is organized around the emotional needs of the field around you. Jung would likely call this a failure of differentiation. Differentiation means becoming psychologically distinct enough that you can remain in contact with others without losing contact with yourself. Without differentiation, relationship becomes fusion. You do not only empathize with others, you reorganize yourself around them. Their discomfort becomes more urgent than your truth. Their mood shapes your choices. Their potential reaction determines whether your own experience is allowed to become visible. This is not love. It is lack of psychic boundary. And because it often looks caring from the outside, it can remain hidden for a long time. There is also a moral distortion here that Jung would have seen clearly. Many people unconsciously equate self-erasure with virtue. They believe that being good means being less disruptive, less demanding, less visible in their own preference. In that arrangement, every act of self-assertion begins to feel morally suspicious. A no feels selfish. Anger feels ugly. Boundaries feel cold. Directness feels cruel. Once that equation is in place, peacekeeping becomes not just practical but righteous. You are not simply keeping things smooth. You are being good. And the shadow fills accordingly with everything that goodness has disallowed. This is one reason why some of the nicest people eventually become the most internally divided. Their conscious self-image has become too narrow to include the full emotional truth of being human. So they remain outwardly gracious while inwardly accumulating bitterness, fatigue, and unprocessed anger. From a Jungian perspective, the solution is not to become less kind. It is to become less one-sided. Kindness must be integrated with truth, empathy with differentiation, peace with self-respect. Otherwise, peace is purchased at the expense of self, and whatever is purchased that way will eventually demand repayment through symptoms. This is what the resentment, fatigue, and hidden grief are doing. They are the psyche's invoice. They are saying, the cost has become too high. Another important aspect here is that peacekeeping often preserves not only relationships, but old emotional worlds. If you have always been the stabilizer, then to stop stabilizing may feel like betraying your role in the family system, the relational system, or the social dynamic. Jung was keenly aware that individuation separates the individual from the collective patterns that previously defined them. That separation often brings guilt. You begin to feel as though asserting your truth is not just a personal act, but a kind of disloyalty. That guilt keeps the pattern alive. You do not only fear conflict, you fear becoming different from the version of you that others have relied on. So the real issue is deeper than, I have bad boundaries. The issue is that your identity has been organized around being a container for discomfort rather than the expression of your own truth. And until that identity is examined, peacekeeping will continue to feel necessary even when it is silently hollowing you out. That is why the question is no longer simply, why can't I say no? The deeper question becomes, what self-image am I still protecting every time I choose harmony over the truth of what I actually feel? That is the real doorway. Because once you see that clearly, you stop treating self-abandonment as a random habit. You begin seeing it as a whole psychological structure built around persona, shadow, guilt, and the fear that disruption will cost you love. And that is exactly the structure that has to change if peace is ever going to stop requiring your disappearance. A different kind of life begins when you stop assuming that every act of self-preservation is an act of harm. That is the threshold. Because as long as your psyche equates truth with disruption, limits with rejection, and self-assertion with cruelty, you will keep returning to the same arrangement. You will continue smoothing yourself out in order to remain lovable. You will continue translating your needs into softer, less inconvenient forms. You will continue managing the atmosphere of other people's emotions while your own interior life becomes quieter, smaller, and harder to reach. But once you begin seeing that pattern clearly, another possibility appears. You can start telling the truth without worshiping conflict and without sacrificing yourself to avoid it. This is important because many people fear that if they stop peacekeeping, the only alternative is hardness. They imagine that if they stop over-accommodating, they will become selfish, reactive, cold, unkind, or emotionally careless. That fear is one of the strongest guardians of the pattern. Jung would likely recognize this as the fear that emerges whenever one-sided identity begins to loosen. If you've been organized around being good, easy, and non-disruptive, then the return of disowned anger, firmness, and preference can feel extreme at first. The ego interprets any movement towards self-assertion as dangerous because it has so little experience integrating that side of the self consciously. This is why the first expressions of truth may feel awkward, too sharp, too guilty, too exposed, not because they are wrong in substance, but because the psyche is not used to occupying a position without immediately judging it. So the work of integration is not to become more aggressive. It is to become more whole, to allow the part of you that say, no, enough, I don't want that, this hurts, this matters, this is not okay, to re-enter conscious life without making them into enemies. That requires a slower, more inward kind of practice than people usually imagine. You begin by noticing your own signals earlier, before the resentment has hardened, before the body is fully shut down, before the fake ease has already carried you into another unnecessary yes. You start listening for the first moment of contraction, the first internal no, the first flicker of exhaustion, irritation, discomfort, or withdrawal. That moment matters enormously, because when you ignore it repeatedly, the psyche learns that your truth only matters after it has become unbearable. But if you begin relating to that early signal with seriousness, the whole emotional rhythm changes. You no longer need your body to scream before your consciousness pays attention. This is often the first step out of chronic self-abandonment, not grand boundaries. Recognition. You begin to ask in real time, what am I actually feeling here? What does my body already know that my social self is trying to override? Am I agreeing because I want to, or because I am afraid of what the atmosphere will become if I don't? These questions are small but decisive. They interrupt automatic accommodation. They create a gap between your conditioned role and your living truth. That gap is where freedom begins. At first, however, freedom may not feel good. This is one of the reasons people fall back into the old pattern so quickly. The moment they tell the truth, even a little more directly, guilt rushes in. The body tenses. The mind starts making moral accusations. You're being harsh. You're making things harder. You should have just let it go. This reaction is not proof that your boundary was wrong. It is often the aftershock of stepping outside the old persona. The old identity does not dissolve quietly. It protests. It tries to restore itself by making self-respect feel immoral. Jung would understand this as the friction of integration. The conscious personality is no longer able to remain one-sided, but it does not yet know how to live in conscious relation to its opposite. So when assertiveness appears, it may initially feel contaminated by shadow. You may fear that if you let your no become real, it will become cruelty. If you let your anger speak, it will become destruction. If you let your needs matter, they will become selfishness. But integration is precisely the process of discovering that these opposites do not have to remain split. You can be caring and firm. You can be kind and clear. You can disappoint someone without betraying love. You can create discomfort without becoming dangerous. This is where maturity becomes far more subtle than peacekeeping ever was. Peacekeeping is often simple in its logic. Reduce yourself, stabilize a field, keep the relationship intact. But conscious truth is more demanding. It requires that you tolerate complexity, that you let another person have their feelings without reorganizing your reality around those feelings, that you allow conflict to exist without treating it as evidence that you have failed morally. For many people, this is revolutionary, because it means another person's disappointment is no longer automatically a command. Another person's discomfort is no longer automatically proof that you should adapt. Another person's emotional reaction may still matter to you, but it does not outrank the truth of your own inner life. That shift changes everything. It changes your speech. You may start speaking earlier, before the resentment has become poisonous. You may say less, but more truthfully. You may stop over-explaining your no in order to make it more palatable. You may stop decorating your limits with so much emotional cushioning that they disappear entirely. This does not mean you become harsh. It means your words stop apologizing for your existence quite so much. That is a major movement psychologically, because chronic peacekeepers often do not only soften their truth, they ask permission to have it at all. They present their needs as hypotheses, their pain as something negotiable, their boundaries as if they were inconveniences rather than necessary expressions of the self. Integration changes the tone. Instead of, "It's totally okay if not," "I'm sorry, maybe this doesn't matter, I know it's probably me, but..." something more direct begins to appear. "I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. I need more time. That hurt. No." Simple statements like these can feel immense if your psyche has long been built around making itself easier for others to manage. And this is where another layer of the work appears: grief. Because as you stop abandoning yourself in the old ways, you'll almost certainly begin to feel grief for how long you have done it. You may look back at conversations, relationships, friendships, family roles, jobs, and realize how often your body knew the truth before your voice allowed it into the room. You may feel sadness for how much effort went into preserving external harmony, while internal rupture was quietly accumulating. This grief matters. If you bypass it, the old pattern can return disguised as moral humility. But if you allow it, something deep begins to reorganize. You start understanding that the cost of peacekeeping was never abstract. It was measured in fragments of self left behind, over and over, in the moments where your own truth became negotiable. Jung would likely see this as part of individuation itself. Individuation is not merely becoming more unique or more self-aware in isolation. It is a gradual movement toward becoming psychologically distinct enough that your life is no longer governed entirely by collective adaptation. In this case, the collective force may be the emotional atmosphere around you, the family role you occupy, the moral expectation that goodness means accommodation, the old pattern that says love must be earned through ease. To individuate here means to become less governable by those forces. Not immune, less governable. That is a very different thing. You still care. You still sense others deeply. You still understand emotional nuance. But you are no longer dissolving into it. That is the beginning of real relational presence. Because paradoxically, self-abandonment does not create deeper love. It creates distortion. It creates relationships in which others may feel connected to you, but are not actually meeting the whole of you. They meet the adaptive self, the softened self, the edited self, the endlessly understandable self. What they do not meet is the full person with resistance, need, boundary, and preference. As that changes, relationships also begin to change. Some may strain. Some may disappoint you. Some may reveal that they depended more heavily on your self-erasure than either of you realized. That can be painful, but it is clarifying. Other relationships may deepen, because the moment your truth becomes more visible, mutuality becomes more possible. Now, the relationship is no longer being held together by your silent adaptation alone. It has to be able to survive the presence of two real selves. That is a far more honest foundation. This also changes your relationship to conflict itself. Conflict stops appearing only as catastrophe. Sometimes it becomes information, a way of seeing where reality actually differs, where values diverge, where expectations need to be clarified, where a relationship can either deepen through truth or reveal its limits through your refusal to disappear. That is not dysfunction. That is life without chronic self-betrayal. And perhaps the deepest change of all is this. Your body begins trusting you again. When you repeatedly override your own signals, the body learns that it is not listened to. It continues sending information, but with less confidence that consciousness will respond. Over time, this contributes to numbness, confusion, and delayed resentment. But when you start honoring the earlier signal, even imperfectly, something repairs. Your body says no, and sometimes your life now says no too. Your body says stop, and sometimes you actually stop. Your body says this hurts, and now the hurt has a chance to become language rather than silent burden. That is profound repair, not because every moment becomes easy, because the inner alliance begins restoring itself. You stop being the person who always translates your truth into something more manageable for others. You become more able to stand beside your own experience, even when doing so changes the atmosphere. And that is the real integration here. Not becoming harder, not becoming selfish, not swinging from endless accommodation into reactive defiance. Something more mature than either extreme. A form of goodness that no longer requires your disappearance. A form of peace that is not bought with self-erasure. A form of love that can hold friction without needing one person to vanish, so that everyone else can remain comfortable. That is what it means to choose truth without becoming cruel. You are not betraying kindness. You are removing the distortion from it. And once that happens, peace can finally stop meaning, I leave myself behind so nothing gets disturbed. It can begin meaning something much deeper. I remain here, fully, even when truth changes emotional weather. That is where real peace begins. Not the peace of suppression. The peace of a self no longer split in half just to keep the room calm. What makes this pattern so difficult to leave is that it often feels like virtue while you're living inside it. You tell yourself you are being patient, understanding, loving, flexible, mature, and sometimes those words are not false. Sometimes you are genuinely trying to protect something valuable, a relationship, a family bond, a moment that does not need to become a battle, a person who is struggling, a situation that would only worsen if handled carelessly. But there's a line, and if that line is crossed often enough, something subtle begins to happen. You're no longer protecting peace. You are sacrificing truth. And when truth is sacrificed repeatedly, the self does not disappear all at once. It fades in fragments. A feeling you do not name, a boundary you do not express, a hurt you reinterpret until it becomes socially acceptable, a no that never reaches language. A need you decide is too inconvenient to matter. This is how self-abandonment usually works. Not through one dramatic act. Through many small betrayals that become so normal, they almost start looking like character. Carl Jung would have understood this as the cost of one-sided goodness. When every personality becomes too identified with one image, especially a morally praised image, the opposite qualities do not vanish. They go underground. And what goes underground does not stop shaping life. It returns as resentment, numbness, fatigue, confusion, silent anger, emotional withdrawal. That is the psyche trying to tell you something simple and painful. The arrangement is no longer sustainable. You cannot keep calling self-erasure love forever. You cannot keep naming your disappearant maturity and expect the soul not to protest. At some point, the old strategy becomes too expensive. You begin to feel the cost in your body, in your energy, in your relationships, in the strange loneliness of being appreciated for a version of yourself that is no longer the whole truth. That loneliness matters, because many peacekeepers are not unloved. They are partially loved. Loved through persona. Loved through the easy, understanding, softened version of themselves. And while that love may be sincere, it does not fully reach the parts that were edited out in order to make the relationship work smoothly. That is where the ache comes from, not only from what others do, from what you keep not allowing. So the deeper question is not merely whether you should become better at boundaries. The deeper question is whether you are finally willing to stop making your own truth negotiable every time harmony is at stake. That is what this whole process has really been asking. Not for aggression, not for rebellion for its own sake, not for coldness. Something much harder and much more honest than that. The willingness to remain a loving person without using love as a reason to disappear. That is real maturity, not the ability to absorb everything. The ability to stay in relationship while still belonging to yourself. Before we close, sit with one question very honestly. Where in your life do you most often leave yourself behind so that nothing gets emotionally disturbed? In love? In family? At work? In friendship? In the little daily moments where your body says no and your mouth says yes? Do not rush the answer, because wherever the answer points, that is where your life is waiting for more of you to return. If this resonates, write in the comments one situation where you recently realized you were keeping the peace at your own expense. Not to shame yourself, to see the pattern clearly. And if you know someone who is always understanding, always accommodating, always calm, always fine, but who seems quietly exhausted underneath it all, you may share this video with them. Because sometimes the deepest betrayal is not what the world does to you. It is what you keep doing to yourself in order to remain easy for the world to hold. And sometimes healing begins in the exact moment you realize this. Peace was never meant to cost you your voice. See you in the next video.